posted on our HWISE YouTube channel. So just to make sure that you all know that. Okay, well, hello and welcome everyone to the first HWISE Now virtual coffee hour. And we are so pleased that you've taken the time to join us today. I have to say we've had a fantastic response to this invitation. And as you see, we have a diverse group of folks joining us. And I would say new faces as well as old faces. So I want to welcome everybody for spending an hour with us today. So for those of you who are new to HWISE, I would like to just introduce myself. I'm Wendy Jepson, and I'm a geographer and university professor at Texas A&M University. I do have several roles. So first, I'm an associate the associate director for the Texas Water Resources Institute. And in this role right now, I also lead the Household Water Insecurity Experiences Research Coordination Network. And this collaboration has been ongoing for many years. And with the financial support of the National Science Foundation, we have been building a community of practice that fosters key analytics and theoretical advances to examine and understand the causes and consequences of water insecurity at the household scale. So my own research examines dimensions of injustice and inequitable water systems and institutions. And I'm really thinking about this in terms of both domestic challenges. I've worked in colonias in Texas, as well as international sites. And I've been working in Brazil since the mid-1990s. So with that, that's kind of who I am and what I'm bringing to this as a director of HWISE. But I'd also like to acknowledge the many contributions, some of those who are here today in building our HWISE community, as well as thanking the National Science Foundation for funding. Many of you have participated in different activities in HWISE, and it's really only with this collaboration that we can move forward. And I just really want to thank you, and I'm grateful for you to join us on this journey. For those of you who are new, we would also like to let you know that our activities as a community are located on our website. It's HWISE-RCN.org. And there you can join information, whether it's our newsletter or our listserv. And we are going to be expanding some of the information provided on that in the next month or so. We're doing a website revamp, so hopefully it'll be more useful for everyone. As I said at the top, we'll be recording the event and hosting it on our HWISE YouTube channel, as well as with other activities we've had in the past. So as I've mentioned earlier, this is a new inaugural event, and we'll be posting our Eventbrite access information for the subsequent sessions over the next several months. And so as we get those going, we'll post those for you. So if you have any questions on that, please let us know. So now for the format today, what I'd like you to do is just make sure your video or your audio is turned off. We are recording, so if you don't want your video on, you can also take that off as well. And the idea is that we're designing this as an informal conversation. And so we'd like to engage questions from the audience as well. So if you have questions as our speakers and our panelists are talking and responding to prompts, please put those in the chat. And Lauren, who is our HWISE program coordinator, and I will be looking at the chat and incorporating that into our discussion. And so that's pretty much what we'll be doing in terms of the logistics. And so before we do anything else, I think it would be fantastic to really move into introductions. And so sort of here we go. In terms of today's panel, and I have a bit of a framing discussion to sort of provide for everybody. So our panel today is really focused on governance of off-network water provision. And I've been thinking about this in terms of rainwater harvesting, bottled water, vended water, sachet water, and other informal systems of water provision. Now, several scholars have engaged with governance questions related to various forms of both literal and political disconnection. I've been thinking about Katie Meehan's work, where she's argued that off-network water, in particularly her case of rainwater harvesting in Tijuana, allows communities to disconnect from the politics of a failed state. And it's really then exercising some form of political autonomy. She's done an amazing job in terms of demonstrating how, as she writes, quote, the ordinary infrastructures of water supply, such as barrels, cisterns, and buckets, common tools in Tijuana homes, both coexist with and limit state power, resulting in variegated geographies of institutional authority, punctuated by alternative spaces of rule. And I'm also reminded of Nikhil Anand and others like Karen Backer, who have tied concepts of belonging and citizenship with being connected to water infrastructure. So Anand writes, quote, hydraulic citizenship emerges through diverse articulations between the technology of politics and the politics of technology, unquote. And he continues to write, it takes a significant amount of work to become and remain a hydraulic citizen. And these quotes are taken from his book, Hydraulic City. And there is an increasing number of scholars working at this interface of formality and informality, hybrid provisioning, etc. And so I thought this would be a perfect opportunity for us to bring these critical questions of off-network water and what that means for governance as we move forward. So that's really the framing that set for our panelists today. And as we dive into that, I wanted to first introduce this fabulous discussant. So that's the framing. We'll do some introductions and then we'll move to a set of prompts. So, okay, guys, please tell us where you work and give us an overview of your research. So Alicia?
Great, thank you, Wendy. So I am an assistant professor at Texas A&M in the Department of Political Science. And I started here in August of last year, so I moved in the middle of the pandemic. And before that, I was a postdoc at Princeton, working with the Andlinger Center for Energy and the Environment. And then before that, I finished my PhD in political science at Columbia. Before that, even I did a master's in international affairs at GPS at UCSD, and an undergrad in human biology at Stanford. So I have an interdisciplinary background and interdisciplinary interests. So my research focuses on water in rural communities in Northeast Brazil, most specifically in the interior of Ceará. So a number of these projects studied the role of community or neighborhood associations on lobbying on behalf of the community for better water services. So for example, getting local politicians to fix the pump on a shared well. And I also look at common pool resource management of groundwater resources in those communities. So for those projects, I conducted many interviews with rural residents, politicians, bureaucrats. I ran a large household survey and designed a large field experiment around groundwater monitoring and management. And then I have other more political science work in Brazil on politicization of drought relief in the Northeast, as well as the effect of COVID-19 on voter turnout. And then other studies in the US look at politics of natural disasters, such as online surveys about how experiencing an extreme weather event, such as being essentially a case study in my own work last week here in Texas, on risk perceptions and political preferences. And I'm also hoping to work more in the US on these topics on rural water security and politics. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. Justin.
All right, well, thanks, Wendy, and thanks everyone else for joining us this morning, afternoon, or evening, depending wherever you are. I'm based at the University of Miami, which really does look like this, although I never see that. My affiliations are, I'm based primarily in the Department of Geography and Sustainable Development, and have secondary appointments in our Department of Public Health Sciences, in our medical school, and our Ecosystem Science and Policy program here. Many of you know me as kind of a behind-the-scenes member of the HWISE leadership team. I also lead our research hub related to population and environment issues. My academic background is being cross-trained in geospatial science and social epidemiology, which has made a very busy time to be an epidemiologist in a pandemic, as you can imagine. I'm broadly interested in all things related to urban health disparities, marginalized communities, or other issues that are generally flying under the radar. I approach my work sort of like an investigative journalist from that sort of perspective. And I have over a decade of work experience on water and infectious disease projects in Ghana. You'll hear about some of that today. My water research began as my graduate work studying different dimensions of the burgeoning packaged water industry in Ghana, known as sachet water. Many of you are familiar with that. This work has looked at water quality, branding, social equity, environmental impacts, and how to integrate this kind of water into our SDG monitoring programs. I'm now most interested in how the different subdimensions of household water insecurity respond to regional population environmental pressures, and how this trickles down to shape household member relations, health, and decision-making in the household related to livelihoods and migration. Thanks.
Raul.
Thank you, Wendy, and thank you everyone for coming and joining us. I am an associate professor with the Methods Lab at the Facultad Latinoamericana de Ciencias Sociales, the Latin American Faculty for Social Sciences, FLACSO. Before that, I was an assistant professor with the Public Administration Division at CIDE, also in Mexico. And before that, I was a lecturer with the Department of Political Science at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver, in Canada. My background is multidisciplinary. I am originally a chemical engineer, and then I did a master's in economics of technical change, and I have a double PhD in political science and human geography. My research focuses on understanding broad questions of resource governance, particularly from a comparative approach. As such, I am very much influenced by the work of Elinor and Vincent Ostrom, both of whom were professors of mine. I have done extensive work on what I call negative commons, those common pool resources that are often devalued and that are only revalued through anthropogenic processing. Wastewater, solid waste, refuse, and bottled water are all negative commons. This ties into my current research projects on off-grid water supply. I am currently undertaking a series of studies on the comparative politics of bottled water governance, which I'm hoping to publish my book this year. I have studied the takeover of the network drinking supply in Mexico by the bottled water industry, and I have also followed its growth in France, Spain, and Italy, where I've also done extensive field work. I'm also working on a study of the growth of the bottled water industry in France, where I did my sabbatical in 2019, precisely to understand ethnographically the perspective of Parisians towards their municipal water supply. And shout out to the Institut d'Études d'Amérique latine, that's Sorbonne Nouvelle in Paris 3. And finally, I am working on a comparative study of public water supply and privatized municipal systems. And while the two cases that I'm going to be studying and that I'm studying have been studied before, León and Aguascalientes in central Mexico, I add nuance to this analysis by comparing them with the Parisian case and adding the wastewater dimension to drinking water supply. I also blog and I also tweet, which you probably know about. So that's me.
Fantastic. So as you can see, we have some serious expertise on the experiences of households and communities with hybrid systems, off-network water, and thinking that this would be a great opportunity. So diving a little deeper, can each one of you tell us more about kind of the governance angle of your work? And you've mentioned a little bit in the introduction, but more specifically, what decentralized systems have been and how they've been part of the work that you've been doing more specifically. So Alicia?
Great, yeah. So I'll be talking mostly about my dissertation work that was in rural communities in Ceará, in Northeast Brazil. And so in these small rural communities, the main governance challenge revolves around getting access to and then maintaining rural water supply systems. So in terms of the governance of these systems, on a few occasions, those systems were managed by either the municipal water supply company. So in Ceará, this is CAGESI, which is run by the state, or some municipalities opted out of the state water company, and it's a group called SAI, which is like a autonomous system essentially within the municipality. So that's the municipal water utility. But this was the exception and usually depended on the number of households, the spatial distribution of those households, and whether the community was close to any pre-existing urban zones where the utility would definitely operate. So many very small communities were outside the mandates of the water utility, and then also sometimes even fell outside other rural development or water management programs from the state. So it was a pretty complex kind of situation where it really varied community to community. But the one thing that tended to be pretty constant across them was the community association. So a community association, it's sometimes called a neighborhood association, a residents association. It's a nonprofit entity. It's a nonprofit organization formally registered with the government as such that's responsible for community-driven development initiatives writ large. So they might petition the local government for access to health clinics. The association might help mobilize the community to clean a local school or to build rainwater cisterns, access retirement pensions for rural workers, enroll community members in other public services. So the community association is a general organization, but in this area, a drought-prone area, the main function of these associations often was management and lobbying for water. So many government and NGO development programs required, at least on paper, the existence of one of these community associations. And so this was required for access to programs regarding rainwater cisterns, desal plants, rural water supply investment, and rural water management. But again, sometimes they just existed on paper, whereas in other times they were very vibrant, both in terms of how active the leadership was or how active the members were. So the association was the biggest player here, but the other main actor is someone called the operator. So this is a community member who's usually responsible for water infrastructure operation and maintenance. So sometimes they're paid, or often paid, a stipend that the kind of community members will pool 1 real or 2 reais per month to put towards this person's stipend. And then this person, just a community member, maintains the piped water system, if there is one, connected to maybe a nearby reservoir or well, or fix any broken pumps or pipes. So there is an elaborate kind of system of different people involved, but I do want to note that community associations in this context do not have legal authority to enforce water use laws or regulations. They cannot set limits on water use. They can't punish users who use excessive amounts. They cannot set pricing. So they differ pretty significantly from water associations or committees or councils in other contexts. I'm thinking of the CAPS in Nicaragua or the CARS or ASADAS in Costa Rica. So they're quite different from those councils. These are community associations that are not legally responsible for water management, but de facto are the main governance. So my research really focuses on these associations and how they both act in terms of water governance, but also advocating for the community politically writ large.
Fantastic. Thank you, Alicia. Justin.
Sure. Well, my earliest experiences with water governance really trace back to the what I remember fondly as like the Wild West of the early sachet water industry, and how that was essentially virtual water infrastructure going back over a decade ago, longer ago than I would like to admit. So back then, this was a burgeoning industry where, you really only needed a few $1,000s, the equivalent of a couple of $1,000s to buy a used machine, and just had to find a connection to the municipal water network in the back of a shack, or other sorts of gray market, black market types of production contexts. And you were in business, and you needed to know someone with a truck, and you could get your product out to market, and it was pretty easy to do. And there wasn't a lot of quality control. People were producing sachets of widely varying quality. I tasted water, tasted like all sorts of things that, kind of like just these memories that I can't get out of my mind, the metal and other types of things. And it was this constant cat and mouse game in terms of regulators trying to get their hands around this industry and figure out how to regulate it and keep the public safe. At the same time, realizing that this new industry was creating tons of jobs, it was creating tons of economic opportunity kind of all along the supply chain. And so that kind of went on for many, many years until about 5 or 6 years ago, you started to really see the industry evolve. And the industry is evolving slowly throughout West Africa and elsewhere, but you see it most visibly in Ghana, where there's been the most accelerated degree of industrialization in that industry. And so there's this evolution of virtual infrastructure, of really the sachet distribution networks being kind of like this invisible extension of municipal piped water networks. Quite successfully getting water out to low-income areas and informal settlements and and places like that, and meeting people's water needs. That virtual water infrastructure has kind of been replaced by this very tangible, physical, industrial footprint of modern sachet and bottled water production. And so on one hand, it's easier for regulators to track production and distribution, But now the producers, which have shifted from small family cottage industry types of producers to now multinational corporations, they've got a lot more political capital. So the governance kind of creeps along because, again, there's a lot of money changing hands, that it's exploded into a multi-billion-dollar industry. The government certainly doesn't want to stifle that. Now, whereas a decade ago, governance first focused on quality control, now it's less necessary because of this industry consolidation and move towards corporatization of all packaged water production. And governance tends to focus more on plastic management and the environment. And plastics have always been a hot button issue. I remember doing my graduate work, a decade ago, it was kind of the Wild West. People were bothered more by all the plastic litter that resulted from all these single serve water containers just kind of littering the street and so forth. They cared more about that than the social equity of people privatizing public water and selling it to the poor and so forth. It was really about the mess and that all those plastic wrappers and water bottles, they get into open sewers, they clog drains, they cause floods. These are the ways that it affects everyday people most saliently. And it's dangerous. There was a big case 3 or 4 years ago where a flooded drain caused a fire at a petrol station and a subsequent explosion that killed like 150 people or something like that. And it was a big deal in the news. And so this is how people think about water delivery. And so again, the governance has kind of shifted to plastic. And so for example, in late 2019, I think October 2019, Ghana became the first African nation to join the Global Plastic Action Partnership. And so the Ghana National Plastic Action Partnership is now their national platform for multi-stakeholder cooperation, and they facilitate initiatives and funding to scale up and accelerate all those in-country partnerships to address plastic waste and pollution. And that's all with an eye, of course, on national progress towards achieving the SDGs. So it's been an interesting evolution of governance, very quickly in a decade.
Fantastic. Raul.
Thank you. So most of my work has been on governance understood as RAW roads, and just, I'm sorry, I come from a political science, public policy, public administration family. So I understand governance as roads does, which is the network multi-level model of governing without government. And that means that multi-level governance and network governance are both oxymorons. All governance is multi-level and networked according to roads. And I agree. So the business of doing governance without government means that there are mechanisms to ensure power sharing, or at least responsibility distribution and allocation. So polycentric governance, which is what Vincent Ostrom, Thibault, and Walker posited in 1961, polycentric governance does get at the core of power sharing. So theoretically, we should all want to have these multi-level network sharing, power sharing model of governance. This is not the case. So one of the reasons why I'm always critical of models like the Governing by River Basin Council's approach that integrated water resources management posits is that it suggests that we ought to engage with the centralized governing of the resource, which would be great if there were mechanisms to ensure actual real decentralization. Given the institutional architecture of Mexican water policy, this is simply untrue because CONAGUA is an extremely hierarchical institution. Now, I have studied polycentric governance for a very long while, particularly the study of wastewater in central Mexico in the Lerma Chapala River Basin. And what I found surprising was that state level governments were much more entrepreneurial about providing wastewater infrastructure than those who are responsible for providing it, the municipal governments. This devolution of responsibilities, which I will discuss in the response to the next prompt, is part of what makes governance such an interesting issue. Now, turning to the issue at hand, and particularly my own research on the governance of bottled water, I echo what Justin mentions. Governing bottled water also requires us to think in various innovative ways to both deal with the plastic component, but also deal with the increasing insecurity that not having access to water is driving the acquisition of this resource. So that's sort of my first impression and my first thoughts on this issue.
Mm-hmm. Exactly, and I'm struck by everyone's discussing it, you know, the premise of this was off network, but if we actually start looking at water sources from many of these provision systems, whether it's sachet or bottled water, it's just differently connected, right? That sachet water does come from a system, or within the rural areas of Brazil, there is some system, but it's not that sort of model of centralized water, which I think we're familiar with. So with that, then I'd like to ask the panelists then, think about off-network water provisioning, which is kind of implies a level of decentralization. What does infrastructure mean in the context then of your research? So how does this require us to rethink governance? And we've been kind of approaching that answer, but I want to push it a little bit further, that going into this world of multi-sourced water hybrid systems, how do we need to rethink governance? And perhaps in your work, you've been thinking about it. So I'm going to hand it over to Alicia, Justin, and then Raul.
Great. So the rural water systems in the areas that I've studied usually involve some combination of a shared well or a shared reservoir, and then a small piped water network. But honestly, something really important and challenging to understand during my fieldwork was just how many different water sources people relied on. So in a drought-prone region, different sources were available at different times. And then on top of that, people use different sources for different uses. So for example, a family might drink water that they purchased from water jugs, which is coming from a bottled water supply network, similar to what Justin and Raul are talking about. They might cook with water from a rainwater cistern. They might bathe and clean with water from the tap, but that tap, again, is connected to a local well or a small reservoir, and it may or may not be treated. People will use rivers or springs if they exist nearby. Sometimes they rely on water trucks, which are usually unreliable and sometimes unsafe if other sources have run dry. And then since most groundwater in the area that I studied was brackish, some communities had small scale desal plants that the state government had installed. But in most cases, they were in disrepair because people didn't know who was even responsible for fixing it. So I'm gonna see if I can share my screen quickly. It's disabled.
Let me do that, sorry. I thought I set it up beforehand. Well, let's see here, share screen. Okay, you should be able to do it.
Okay, great. So this is a photo of a map that was created by one of the rural communities in a participatory mapping exercise that was part of a field experiment that I was involved with, or the kind of designed and implemented. So it's in Portuguese, but so I'll kind of walk you through it. So in the middle is the associação, that community association that I mentioned before. And then each black square is a house, and each blue dot is a rainwater cistern. So that was part of the 1 million cisterns program. That was a huge, really critically acclaimed program that the government did. There are poço as well, and casimbão is going to be a shallower well, whereas prof is referring to profundo, which is a deep well. And if there's an X in it, it means it has water. So many of the deep wells did not have water, either because they dried out or because the pump was broken. Many of the shallow wells did have water, although not all of them. This small rural community had a caixa, a water tank, that I think was connected to a deep well, which is then connected kind of via these little pipes to some sort of small distribution system. There's also a nascente, a spring, because they're close to some mountains, so they were lucky to have access to spring water, and a river that flowed nearby. So this particular community had very rich water resources. Many of the communities that I visited did not have such a plethora. But what I want to point out is that each one of these different sources was installed by a different government program or by a different local political actor. So I'm just going to stop sharing on that. But so each one of these involved a different interaction with the local political economy. So purchasing water from a private entity, some of whom may have political connections or not, rainwater cisterns installed by the public NGO partnership. The small pipe networks were usually installed by the state government through a rural development program, or, quote, gifted by local elites or politicians, usually with some expectation of voting for them in the future. But then maintenance for all these things usually falls on the community or the community's ability to get City Hall to fix it. So there was a program called CISAR, SISAR, which is an NGO that provides technical assistance and oversees household water use billing, among other things, and I'll mention it a bit more later. Water trucks would have come from the Army through a drought relief program or from the mayor. And then those springs or ponds or rivers might be on private property nearby. So while the water itself is considered public property, getting access to it requires permission to be on private land. So this gets so complicated. And what I focused on in terms of this interaction between infrastructure and governance was the role of political power in knowing, one, who to call to fix any of these things. You have to know first who you should even be talking to in this very complex landscape. And then second, have the influence to get that landowner or city hall or state agency to actually fix it. And so what my research ended up actually focusing on, and that emerged from my interviews, was that a lot of residents and leaders explained to me that they used their votes, their vote in the municipal elections to get that influence. So they would say, we concentrated our votes in one city council member last election. And so then that person, whether or not she won or lost, would have a linkage to the community. And so when the community needed something, the leader could either call them or send a WhatsApp message and say, hey, we gave you 100 votes, please help us. And in Brazilian municipal elections, especially for city council, 100 votes can be pivotal. So, and there are dozens of candidates. And so this linkage is challenging, but important for both the community and the politicians. And the precinct level voting records are public, so they can monitor this. So I've done a number of statistical analyses about this using household surveys merged with electoral data. And I do find that households are more likely to have secure water access when they have a constant community leader who knows how to navigate this complex bureaucracy. When the community tends to have better social capital or trust in others, they're more likely to have better water security and be able to coordinate around these different features. And then if they concentrated their community vote in one candidate in the last election, they're also more likely to have better water access. So I found that infrastructure, governance, local social dynamics, and then especially municipal politics were totally intertwined. And so for me, thinking about governance and water governance in this case requires really acknowledging this diverse set of overlapping infrastructure and the political economies of each of them.
Fantastic. Justin and then Raul.
So interestingly, when I think about infrastructure and the sachet water industry, I think about infrastructure along the supply chain. It's kind of the easiest way for me to think about it. And governance kind of appears in, I don't want to say unlikely places, but it's not there throughout not terribly prevalent throughout the supply chain. So at the very beginning, you have people producing sachets, companies nowadays digging their own wells rather than just sucking water out of the municipal system. So there's the wells, there's the physical infrastructure involves pumps, storage tanks, and then of course the filling machines and the branded plastic rolls. Then next in the supply chain are the distributors, essentially trucks and fuel. Then you have wholesalers who may only need a small building to be in business and maybe refrigeration, maybe not, since that's often not being sold direct to consumers. And then of course, retailers who again, maybe have physical storage space needs, but none if they're vending by foot, if they're just buying a large bag at a time and doing head top vending at local markets and things like that. And retailers often do have refrigeration or at least access to ice. And then, finally, consumers are at the end of that supply chain, and they just would have some physical storage space requirements in their home. It's common for people to buy lots of bags of sachets in bulk and just have this kind of like this physical cube of water in plastic, like in the corner of their kitchen or some other place, just for storage. And then, of course, the very end of the supply chain is the plastic waste disposal. And it's really just the very beginning and the very end of that supply chain where you see governance and where politics comes into play. Initially with wells, right? Because the drilling of wells, especially in these industrial sized production facilities, those corporations are drilling quite a lot of wells, and so there's important implications for groundwater management, and so that's where the ministries get involved to regulate that. So who gets to drill, where, how much is allowed to be extracted, and again, what types of favors are granted, to those industries that are not granted to others who are looking looking for lesser expensive or more stable water sources. Although most companies that need to drill wells are generally able to. So there's the groundwater management at the beginning, and then of course, as I already mentioned, the plastic waste disposal at the very end. And what's interesting about that is that the pressure for plastic waste disposal has primarily come from within the industry, because, again, going back a decade, it was like every year or two, Parliament threatened to take up a bill and threatened to just ban plastics altogether if the industry didn't clean itself up. And so through internal competition is how we've developed biodegradable sachet wrappers, which are not the standard yet, but we're kind of moving in that direction, and just how all that energy was created to organize the original Ghana Plastic Waste Manufacturers Association and so forth, and getting Ghana signed up for these international programs. Now, what's notably absent in this supply chain is containers, right? Because again, you have the single serve unit, just like with bottled water, although really the plastic is just in another form, which urgently has to be dealt with again at the end of the supply chain and integrated into a circular economy, which is the direction that all of that is going.
Thank you. And Raul, and I also have the shared available for you. Shared screen.
As usual, I'm muted. Thank you, Wendy. So this is an incredibly complex question that I would like to address from the perspective of someone who focuses on the public policy questions around infrastructure. And I'm also a chemical engineer, so this makes me think of infrastructure as the hard technologies, that is, those that are built with engineering prowess. But there is an increasing number of different infrastructures, both social and engineered. How water is supplied and provided is also dependent on the types of infrastructures we have and how those interact with the social and economic, political and political components of society. Governing infrastructure also requires us to understand who is responsible for providing this infrastructure. My approach as a political scientist and public policy and public administration scholar is to assign responsibility for public affairs and the provision of public services to governments. This has to do with the idea of the public. What is public and who is the public? These are questions that are always dicey to address because evolving governance arrangements for water supply provision have involved both communities, so community-driven water supply networks and processes, and private actors, which are usually water utility operators, but also those who sell and provide bottled water. So depending on the institutional arrangement and the organizational architecture that govern drinking water supply, local or subnational governments are responsible for providing infrastructure, but they are also often the least able to collect taxes. This financial and fiscal insecurity also drives poorly maintained infrastructure for everything associated with water supply. However, there are also moments when governments purposely devolve their responsibilities to private actors and members of the public. This phenomenon is what I call infrastructure denial, where governments simply do not provide the infrastructure and suggest individual responses to collective problems. Now, infrastructure denial has a very long history, and thank you for providing me with the possibility to share my slide. I'm going to share a slide for you. This is the history of bottled water in Mexico. So bottled water in Mexico started when the earthquake in 1985, which is on my birthday. You should all know that it's September 19th. It's terrible that both earthquakes in Mexico happened on my birthday, which is really sad. So an earthquake of 8.1 degrees hit Mexico, affecting the infrastructure. But if you see, in 1991, the Mexican federal government recommended to its citizens that they should seek safe water from private suppliers. This is infrastructure denial, right? And also shout out to all of you who are historians, because I actually took a historiographical approach and I went to the archives to be able to reconstruct this history of bottled water in Mexico. So I'm gonna close out because I know that we have questions and so on. So I just want to say that this is a complete dereliction of duty, and this approach to infrastructure provision, where communities need to ensure their own access instead of the government providing, is troubling at best and plain nefarious at worst. Public services are the responsibility of governments, and while there are private and public actors to engage in co-production or public-private partnerships, the main responsibility of the government is to ensure that everybody has access to potable drinking water, ensuring the human right to water. Thank you.
So thank you. And in a way, the descriptions of these various complex infrastructures for providing water suggest that maybe the premise of the title of this group, which is off-network water, maybe it should be differently networked provisioning, right? And that it's not necessarily off or on, that binary seems to be really upended by the experiences that you've brought to the discussion today, but it's indeed differently networked. And I think and I know as water scholars, for those of us who may not be in public health or have, that's not my wheelhouse, but of course I work with those who engage in public health issues. There's always this question that comes up about water quality, right? And so Christina Heck, thank you for joining us from California, has asked the question, in these, let's just say, differently networked systems, as we've all described, what is in place or should be, and I think this sort of normative question is important, what should be in place for water safety and storage hygiene? So I don't know who'd like to jump in on that question. We think about these differently. Yes, Alicia, go ahead.
Yeah, so I focused my research on water access, but the safety and storage issue did come up a lot. So it wasn't the main focus of my research, but it did come up a lot. So for example, the water truck water often had really poor quality because the water truck drivers, instead of going to the places they were supposed to, instead of going to the municipal treated water plants, they would just suck water out of an irrigation ditch. And so kind of, the most marginalized communities were the ones who were most likely to have that happen and the least likely to be able to have recourse when that did happen. The rainwater cisterns, which are an amazing, have played an incredible role in this drought-prone region in providing drinking water during the dry season. Those cisterns do require maintenance and cleaning, and cleaning every season. And so there have been issues around water quality, especially for the cisterns that were part of the earlier installations of the project. So they've done an amazing, truly amazing effort in terms of improving water security from a access and perspective, but the quality side is more challenging. And people often told me, that maybe the government or these development programs had given them chlorine tablets to put in their water, but they didn't like the taste of it. And I don't know if that was something about the tablets or it was something about the way it was done, such that too much was being used. But people were pretty opposed to that because it was very unpleasant to drink. And so they're kind of weighing these different challenges, because I think focusing on water quality would have been another dissertation. And so I didn't focus on that, but it did keep coming up, and I really appreciate that question.
Raul. Oh, sorry,
can
Christina,
I
then
just-
Raul. Yeah.
I'll just insert one quick comment. Agree that it's another dissertation, at least one. 2 comments. The water hygiene issue, in my opinion, needs to extend all the way down to household storage, because if people are taking that water truck water and putting it in plastic buckets in the corner of the kitchen or something, you know, who knows what happens then. I just want to say that this issue of water quality from my end is really important, because we want people to drink water, not sugary beverages, for all kinds of other health and even environmental reasons. And so in order to make sure that sugary drinks don't look like a safer, more appealing, or more accessible, whatever beverage, we really need to think about the quality of the drinking water. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Go ahead, Raul.
Thank you. I would like to follow up precisely on what Christine just said, because that is exactly what Coca-Cola has done in Chiapas. So in Chiapas, Coca-Cola, it's easier to access, in some parts of Chiapas, it's easier to access Coca-Cola than it is to access piped water. And particularly because a lot of the reservoirs are not clean enough, and even the pipes, the infrastructure is so poorly maintained that it's really hard to do this. So I agree with Christina on this issue. I also wanted to mention that in the particular case of, I'm a chemical engineer, right? So I know how to do the treatment of the water, and we have great engineering. What we don't have is investment in engineering, in treatment, in infrastructure, and maintenance. And that's very problematic. You will ask, if you ask people in Mexico, and I've run household surveys and ethnographic work, and if you ask them, will I drink water from the tap? They will say no. But a lot of times, individual municipal networks, the utilities actually provide the water at drinkable quality. The problem is that when it leaves the water utility and it gets all the way to the household, and if it comes into the reservoir, the tinaco, or it's going to be very, very problematic, because they're not well maintained. So, you know, what was perfectly good water of the network, of the grid, and coming into your household is no longer good quality. Now, this is not unsolvable. Individual household filters can and do solve this. My research on bottled water has demonstrated that the shift to bottled water has also been the result of convenience, but also the result of infrastructure denial. If the government is not providing this, and if I'm not also making, inserting individual filtering systems, then what happens? It's so much easier to just go and buy bottle large 20-liter jugs. This is different to the situation in Texas and in Flint, of course, and these are situations of disasters. But this substitution of the individual municipal is actually a dereliction of duty.
So as I'm thinking about this, then, what does it mean for governance? Are there ways in which we can, and maybe this is my own bias, but knowing how the politics operate in Brazil, and even seeing it in the Texas colonias, the notion that we will all be centralized, that, and I appreciate the notion of the infrastructural denial, but I guess I'm also a realist to think that not all people are going to be connected to a centralized system. So in that context, how are we to think about governing quality to the scale, as Christina mentioned, of the household? What are the ways in which we can reconfigure the role of the state as not just the provider of the physical water, but are there ways in which the state can operate in service to addressing the quality questions that we see in these differently networked systems? And that's something that, for me is there's no real answer as a challenge, but just, I guess, for me, coming to the realization as I've worked through over many years in different places, that you do have differently networked water. So you still may have Cagesi in Brazil, but they also get water from all these different other places. So how can we think of this role of the state in relation to those quality questions, and how can they interact? So in the context of Brazil, for example, and it just so happens Alicia and I work in the same state, in Ceará, but the public health community public health office might have a different role. So I'm always thinking about ways in which we can rethink creatively about what the state is going to do. Is it a provider of water, or is it a provider of services to help with attaining safe and quality water? Justin, what are your thoughts? Oh, you're on mute.
Sorry about that. I'm looking at some of the new questions that are coming in, and interestingly, packaged water kind of it doesn't make the water safety and storage issue completely go away, but it does relative to every other type of vended water, right? If you're off network, and that's clearly been part of its success. And a couple of participants have chatted in questions about affordability, and yes, you're paying a much higher unit cost certainly for bottled water. Sachet water is lower, but still many times that of tap water. And so it's private water. It's bailing out the government of their responsibility to provide potable water, but people are willing to pay. Even in some of the poorest communities where we've done survey work and asked about people's motivations, we found that even in urban slums, there are communities where people have access to semi-regular, decent quality water for household use, but they're still spending the very, very little disposable income that they have on packaged water, generally sachet water instead of bottled water. So yeah, and there's another comment there that the U.S. doesn't regulate quality, right, of bottled water the same way it regulates network water, and other governments seem to be following suit, and that's problematic. And I'd love to hear Raul and Alicia comment on that from the regulation perspective, from a community board perspective where Alicia works, and Raul, maybe you can talk about bottled water regulation in Mexico. In either order.
Okay, sure. So bottled water is and I'm working on a paper on this. So bottled water is not really well regulated in Mexico. It's not regulated at the extraction point. It's not regulated in quality per se. So bottled water is taken as a food. So there is a national Mexican regulation, the Norma Oficial Mexicana, the Mexican official norm, and it does argue that there are certain limits that of specific minerals and components so on, but the actual governance and regulation of the process of bottling water is not regulated at all, which has also created pirated water. So now the bottled water that you're getting may actually not even be Ciel or Aqua or Bonafont or whatever. It may actually be literally extracted from anybody's tap and filtered and just repackaged as Ciel water. This phenomenon of pirated bottled water to me is bewildering. I mean, I get, and this I agree with Wendy. I think we agree more than we disagree. Yes, there are different. Not everybody's going to be connected to the government network. That's true, but there should be governance mechanisms that ensure that there is access, that there is connection. And remember, connection is not always doesn't always mean supply. This is something very, very, very important. That being connected does not mean that you're getting water, because there's a very clear phenomenon in Mexico. We call it tandeos. So you get water 2 hours a day, or an hour a day, or 30 minutes a day, and that is water provisioning in the sense of SDGs. I had this conversation with Marguerite Svartin and Michelle Cui at IHE Delft 2 years ago, where I said, well, I'm not completely sure we should let anybody include bottled water into the SDG number 6, simply because that's again a dereliction of our duty as academics, because bottled water cannot simply mean that you have access to what, that you have enacted the human right to water. That's the point that I make in the book chapter that I wrote in Farhana Sultanas and Alexander Loftus' book. I mean, bottled water can be a mean to enact the human right to water temporarily. in situations like Texas or like Flint. But this is a temporary measure. This cannot be, this is not sustainable. And this is not what I would expect from a healthy, functioning water provision system.
Thank you. Yeah, and to follow on this, the thread of this conversation, there are several people in the chat who brought up the question of trust and how that intersects with the challenge of governance. And so let's see here, there's a lot on here in trust. Let's see. Sarah Beth says that, and I'm going to read the chat. When we're talking about water quality and governance, the issue of trust keeps coming up or underlying what we're saying. She works in Niger, but she also lives up the road from Flint, as many of you might know. And there's an extreme distrust by residents of Flint of various entities' assessments of water quality or alternative water sources. So when we talk about governance, there's an implicit notion of, well, we trust them, but in fact that shouldn't be assumed. And in the context of not just other countries, but we see across the board the issue of trust emerging. So I don't know what you would, the panelists would like to comment in terms of the role of trust as it relates to these questions of not just differently networked water, but also the quality questions that we've been discussing.
Yeah, I'd be happy to jump in on that. Trust has been a big part of my research, and just kind of building on a couple of the points that were mentioned before. So bottled water in the areas where I study is sometimes local businesses that may be regulated, but usually it's more pirated. And the reality is that people are buying that because they don't trust the tap water when they do have it. Either the municipal network, if they are truly connected to the municipal supply, or the small piped water systems. And politicians also, I mean, it sounds like, and Raul's work on this is really interesting as well, the manipulating this sense of trust. So that NGO that I mentioned, CISAR, I mean, what they basically do is they're a network of communities where there's a central hub with maintenance equipment, technicians, and billing agents. So they install hydrometers for each household, they bill households for their water use, and then they provide this training and maintenance for the pump on the well, and they also encourage water treatment and better water quality. So there are some municipalities where the mayors won't let CISAR operate because they see it as a threat to their ability to use water to get votes. And that controlling the water supply and the trust in the water supply and the quality, and then also to Raul's point that just because you have a piped network in the census doesn't mean that water actually comes out of it, or water that you would be willing to drink. And a lot of people showed me buckets of water, this is what comes out of the tap and it's brown. And so, there are mayors who won't let these more autonomous, actually getting off network programs function because it reduces their political control over that system. But more enlightened mayors say, hey, this is a great program. People often really like it. It can really improve their lives. I want to get credit for bringing CISAR into my municipality, and they do welcome it in. So, you see things going both ways, but water, especially in this drought-prone area, is this very contentious point of political control often.
This is an amazing conversation, and I just got a ding saying I have a 2-minute warning, but it's actually been an hour. So what I'd like to do as we wrap up, there's a couple different things and action items moving forward. So I'd like, of course, each one of our panelists to sort of make some final comments. But if you have to jump off at the hour, what I do want to invite you to do is please get in contact with HWISE with myself through the HWISE email, which is hwise.rcn@gmail.com. If you want to continue this conversation, we have this recorded. We also are retaining the chats. There's lots of great questions. And as, again, not only just a community of interested scholars, but a community of practice, we feel like this is a topic that we would like to expand on. And if you're interested in working with or collaborating on papers on this topic and pushing forward these ideas, please do contact me through the HWISE email, and we can certainly get everybody together in a longer conversation for maybe a longer kind of mini workshop on this topic. This is exciting, new ideas and sharing across experiences and regions. And so I want to make sure that those who have to jump off right now are welcome and invited to contact me. So with that, I just want to hand it over to our panelists for some closing comments, and then we'll wrap up. So we'll start Alicia, Justin, and Raul, which is the alphabetical order, just to say there's alphabetical order here.
Thank you. I won't say much because I got a chance to respond to that last question and the other panelists didn't, but I just wanted to say thanks to everyone for this great conversation.
Justin.
I want to thank everybody. I guess just recap by just going big picture here. Consuming sachet water is or any packaged water, right, is a tacit acknowledgement of state failure. And so you can see why the state's attempt to get involved and regulate is at odds with, you know, what the identity of hydraulic citizenship that Wendy talked about at the very beginning. So if anybody's interested in following up and talking more, maybe writing about some of these themes, please let us know. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. And I just want to also touch on hydraulic citizenship because I had a doctoral student who wanted to study the topic. And interestingly enough, my own mother, Dr. Vega Lopez, has also written about hydraulic or water citizenship. For Dr. Vega Lopez, the view of water citizenship refers to an ownership of the resource phenomenon, not owning in the sense of a community, which well water effectively is, but owning the responsibility of sustainably managing and providing the resource. This is an interesting view because most of the literature I've read on indigenous views of water, and shout out to Nicole Wilson, Leila Harris, Samir Shah, and the Canadian group who looks at these First Nations views of water and governance, does indeed appear to create the notion of hydraulic citizenship as a shared responsibility for the resource. In off-grid networks, this is much more complex because the number of actors who participate in the system increases as there are private vendors, those who sell water from trucks and sell bottled water. Finally, I just want to mention that in my fieldwork in France, Spain, and Italy, I found an interesting, quite funny approach to hydraulic citizenship that I wanted to share with you. When I interviewed locals, I asked them if they didn't feel bad that their water reservoirs were being depleted so that the water was solved. They told me, oh no, we want the world to know our taste of water. So yes, French people are proud of Perrier and Evian, and Italian people are proud of Aquapana, and Spanish are also proud of their own networks. That looked to me just to be, that was just bewildering. So I just want to share that as a funny anecdote.
Okay, I don't know if you can hear me. I just had a problem with my internet. Can you hear me?
Yes.
We can.
Yes.
Okay, good. So I can't see you. I just had a problem with my internet. So in closing, just to wrap things up, I do want to thank everybody for attending our discussants and for all of you to join us in our first inaugural virtual coffee hour. I do want to mention our next one is March 31st on the topic of HWISE beyond the household, water insecurity in schools and healthcare facilities, with an amazing group of scholars, including Greg Pierce, Cassie Workman, Ellis Adams, Godfred Boateng, and Christina Hecht. The Eventbrite will be available soon on our website. And again, if you have any questions, let me know. You can contact us again at hwise.rcn@gmail.com. And so with that, I want to thank all of you, and we'll see you in a month. Take care. Bye-bye.